Begin by saying my name is Sheila Ronis. I am a professor and chair of the Department of Management at Walsh College in Troy, Michigan. I also hold a special term appointment with Argonne National Laboratory, part of the U.S. Department of Energy, and run for them by the University of Chicago. But all of my comments today are my own opinions and work, and do not express the position of the United States government. What I'm going to share with you is really the work since the writing of Timelines into the Future, which was an impetus for many organizations in the United States, within the U.S. government, but also in the private sector. And other organizations. Many nonprofits have also, I know, worked with me and have used the fundamentals that are in this book. And so let me go through some of my ideas with you so you'll get a better understanding of where we are and where we hope to go in the near future. In 2008, the Project on National Security Reform, which was a congressional commission, included a vision working group, one of 10. And this was a massive overhaul and study of the United States national security system that provided the Congress recommendations for how to completely reconfigure what our national security system needed to look like for a 21st century world, since it had not fundamentally changed since the National Security Act of 1947. And even with Goldwater-Nichols Act, which required jointness within the Pentagon, we now needed to look beyond defense and look more broadly at what national security looked like today and just how interconnected all the elements of national power are, and develop an appropriate system for that. And the Vision Working Group recommended that there be more interagency and intergovernmental collaborative process capabilities within the White House. And the Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions is a prototype of what that might look like, so that we could develop some proof of concept. It is also based on the work of Professor Leon Firth, who was at George Washington University and the National Defense University. And Professor Firth worked on something called the Project on Forward Engagement, looking at a whole of government approach called anticipatory governance. His philosophies and theories have informed not only my work, but the work that he and I are continuing to do together as we move forward in developing these proof of concepts. Professor Firth was in the White House for 8 years during the Clinton-Gore administration, and he served as the National Security Advisor to the Vice President at that time. In 1990, I read the U.S. National Security Strategy for the very first time. It was also the very first time that I realized as a citizen that there was nothing to hang it onto. When I think of strategy, I think of something that's hierarchical. And if you develop a national defense strategy or a national foreign policy, you need to attach that to a national policy or strategy of some sort. And it was really the first time that it became clear to me that the United States did not have any such document, and nor did it have any such process as a major part of how it conducted its affairs from day to day. In fact, more than 25 years ago, I then decided it was time for me to think about what would happen if the United States actually could develop such a process, a system, and a strategy. And that's when my work really began in earnest. This continues, unfortunately, to be the case. We don't develop grand strategies, and of course, a big part of this process is to figure out methods and mechanisms. And the Project on National Security Reform was a perfect vehicle to really examine that issue. In the private sector, as a professor of management in a business school, of course, I've been involved in how the private sector uses management tools. Some organizations use them better than others, but it was, why can't we do this in the U.S. government in particular? And that has been a part of what I hope will be almost a technology transfer from private sector to public sector, at least in terms of best practices. And so the real question is, what mechanisms should the U.S. government develop to do this? And that's an easy question, but it doesn't have any easy answers. Because the U.S. security is rooted in the successful integration of all elements of national power. And it's my understanding from my work that because of the methods of financing our federal government, especially through the congressional committee structure to the executive branch, there are clear limitations as to what we can and cannot do, what we call the colors of money, which have to do with who the money belongs to and who can spend that money, who has the authority to spend that money. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that arena that we have begun to talk about, but we haven't really addressed yet. And what is the basis for rethinking the national security system? And our working group defined national security in a very broad sense to look at the health and stability of all elements of national power, not just the traditional military establishment or military intelligence establishment, because that simply isn't sufficient. And the national security system, therefore, we defined very, very broadly. Although it came with a price, which is a lot of people were leery and didn't understand, and because it didn't conform to their belief system, it has provided a lot of challenges to us. But I think it's necessary either way. And the system scientist in me knows that we can't separate out these issues. They are intertwined. And so if you don't even make an attempt to understand the interconnections and interrelationships, you get into trouble. From the system scientist perspective, the national security system in the United States is a complex adaptive system, whether we say so or not. So I think we might as well say so. And then really step back and say, okay, now what does that really mean? What are the characteristics of complex adaptive systems so that we can deal with them in the real world? So we went out and identified a few of the characteristics. You have to be able to share information and collaborate horizontally in such a system. You have to accommodate unanticipated needs and partnerships, and frequently those that you haven't considered before. You need to ensure agility in the face of uncertainty. There's no other way to describe it. You need to incorporate ad hoc structures and processes. And perhaps most important, you need to maintain a long-term view. And that has been a very difficult task for us in the United States. But it is not just an understanding of complex systems. You have to understand that most of the messy problems that we address today are composed of complex systems of complex systems. And the military feels very comfortable with the notion of systems of systems. And that's because they deal with complicated systems like weapon systems. But they are only complicated They are not complex. And when you add the complexity into the equation, you're dealing with a very different animal. And one of those characteristics of complex systems is you cannot predict and control what is going on inside the system. Well, you tell that to a military general and they don't want to believe it. But the reality is, in a complex system, you can't predict the behavior, nor can you control what's going on inside it. So you have to really understand the dynamics of that system if you expect to affect any change at all. I find it very troubling that most policymakers don't understand anything about complexity. They don't understand it's a natural phenomenon in the real world. And I think scientists, probably like me, have done a dreadful job of articulating why that matters to a policymaker. And there's an enormous amount of work, though, that needs to occur to make that real. But I've stopped trying to explain it in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, which is natural for a physicist to want to do, because the laws of thermodynamics are difficult to understand. They include a tremendous amount of mathematics, and so we tried to find ways within the English language to describe complex systems, and they may not work as well as some would like, but I think they're better than trying to just, give a lot of equations and explain it that way. So that we start with the most important premise, which is complex systems can't be controlled. The good news is they can be influenced. But they can only be influenced if you understand them intimately. I mean intimately. And so you really have to have a method to understand things in a very deep way. And from the standpoint of the U.S. government, we said, we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge within the United States government, in the State Department, in the entire military intelligence establishment, but somebody needs to coordinate that. And we really need to create a method to do that. And honestly, in a 3-branch of government representative democracy, we don't have a prime minister, but we do have capabilities within the executive office of the President of the United States. So that's where we think the center needs to exist. Subsequent to the project on national security reform, it has become clear to us it is also necessary in the other 2 branches of government. And we're just beginning now to do the kinds of studies that are necessary to determine where this capability would need to reside in those branches. But we don't have very many answers yet. We hope we're asking the right questions. The reason for that is we need to find methods to synthesize all of government's solutions to complex system issues and problems, and sometimes all of society. And I put solutions in quotes for a reason, and that's that very few complex system issues have solutions. And they certainly don't have one solution. They may have multiple solutions. And sometimes the best you can hope for is to ameliorate a situation, to make it better. But to actually solve a problem is impossible. Now, we think that foresight is a key component of our approach because in a story, you can illustrate systemic effects and you can illustrate complexity without forcing somebody to have to learn the physics and mathematics of why it is the way it is. But you can explore in a story and you can learn in a story. And one of the most important elements of complexity is you need to be in a continuous learning mode of what is going on inside the system if you want to have an impact on that system. So we have created what we call visionarios, which are very in-depth stories that they use disciplined foresight processes, but they also marry them to the science of complexity and systems, to the point where now we're trying to actually build complexity science algorithm models at Argonne to reflect and test different assumptions in a complex system, agent-based models. And it's a very powerful tool, and it can enable you to improve and inform public policy decisions. There are 5 general questions that we almost always ask of the visionario. What are the stressors in the scenario? Was the system able to anticipate the problems described? How well was the system able to react? How well was the system able to recover? And how well does the system function as a whole? And these are just pretty basic, but imperative to answer. Discussion questions that then these lead to include how will any recommendations function, because this is really important to ask so that you can think about, once you decide on a course of action, how will it function? How will it work? Are there problems or solutions identified that we haven't addressed? And if this future isn't desirable, what choices should we be making today to avoid it? Because this is a step that we frequently never get to as we work with various scenarios. And yet it's one of the most crucial, because we don't really think of, well, should we have a contingency here? And how do we develop that contingency? And maybe one contingency isn't enough. Maybe we need 2, 3, or 4 contingencies. Brexit is a perfect example where someone should have gamed Brexit so that they went on television and said and explained to the people who were voting, here are some data, we developed these models, and we have a general understanding of what might happen if we go this route, and here are other models that say what also may happen, so that you can look at second, third, and fourth order effect of decisions, because so rarely those systemic elements are just never considered. And it can be catastrophic.
Right.
Well, quickly describe our vision for the center is to use the application of advanced systems approaches to ameliorating complex problems and improving policy and strategy decision making. Not solving problems, but improving them, ameliorating them. And our mission is to provide the capability through the systems level integration of foresight, insight, and strategic leadership models with high-powered complexity science and decision technologies over time. And of course, there are many, many tools in the tool set. And what you need to do is use the right tool at the right time for the right set of circumstances. Because there's no one set of tools that is going to get you where you need to go every time. One of the things I wanted to describe was the fact that we think maneuvering within the complexity of today's world requires strategic thinkers who have the ability to understand nonlinear and unintended consequences of their policies and decisions. This is really critical in a world of complexity, and we frequently describe it to our policymakers in the United States as the West playing chess and the East playing Wei Qi or Go, and neither group understanding why, when they're trying to work together, they're playing by different sets of rules, cultures, worldviews. And this is very helpful in describing why so frequently you can have disastrous effects simply through misunderstanding.